There's a pretty common situation that happens anytime that you or a friend tries to teach a new person how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And it goes something like this. You'll activate a card like Reinforcement of the Army or another normal spell, and your opponent, because they don't know how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Yet, flips a card like Mystical Space Typhoon to try to negate and destroy that Reinforcement of the Army. Because you've played Yu-Gi-Oh! You know that it doesn't get negated, and you tell them that Mystical Space Typhoon doesn't negate the card and it just destroys it, and they say, okay, that makes sense. The problem and the confusion arises a couple turns later when your opponent activates a Call of the Haunted, and then you activate your own MST from your hand and say this prevents the card from resolving. At this point, your opponent, the new player, is a little bit confused and maybe even a little bit angry because just a few turns earlier you told them that MST doesn't negate, but when it works in your favor, you're negating their card with MST. This is a very confusing situation for many new players, and many players that even been playing the game for a few months if no one's explained the ruling to them. And in today's video, we're going to talk about the history of MST negating cards and some situations where it actually does prevent cards from resolving, as well as apply this to some more modern and different examples, especially examples that transcend spells and traps and go into monster cards as well. First off, it has to be said at the beginning of this video that the word negate is actually a specific game term from the rulebook's glossary and should be only used in the situations where it's supposed to be. A great example of this is Solemn Judgment, a card that many players are familiar with, and Solemn Judgment is one of those cards out there that specifically negates other cards. There are certainly examples of this that are found outside of counter traps, but pretty much every single counter trap in some way is going to be negating something, whether or not that's a card effect or a summon or an attack. Counter traps are the place where you can look and know that almost all the cards that you're looking at are going to be negating a specific action. I mention this because the surface level analysis of all the Yu-Gi-Oh cards like Mystical Space Typhoon is that they don't say the specific word negate, therefore they do not negate cards. You see, in 2011, Yu-Gi-Oh added problem-solving card text, and in general, for the most part, cards will say exactly what they do. Cards that target say the word target, and cards that don't target don't say the word target, so therefore we know things like Dark Hole, that a lot of people are kind of confused about, don't actually target cards because it doesn't use the specific word. In the same vein, cards like Mystical Space Typhoon that don't use the word negate do not negate cards. That is just a general rule of thumb to follow if you're sort of starting out in Yu-Gi-Oh and wondering why cards like MST don't negate other cards. It's because they don't say they negate them. I know it seems pretty simple, it might sound like I'm being patronizing here, but it's just worth mentioning that most Yu-Gi-Oh cards will say exactly what they do if you read each word of the effect and don't just assume what they do. However, let's go back to that ruling that I mentioned at the beginning of this video to sort of explain a new layer of confusion for a lot of players in the game. Why is it that MST doesn't work against normal spells but does work against things like Call of the Haunted? Well, there's another ruling that is a little bit unspoken. You certainly can find it in the rulebook nowadays, but for a while it wasn't explicitly said, and that's that you basically should treat all cards like continuous spells and field spells and equip spells and pendulum spells. You should treat all of those cards as if they had the effect that you must control this face-up card to activate and to resolve this effect. There are some monster cards that have that on its text, and I'll mention those in a second, but in general, for all of those cards that are like continuous field equips and pendulums and all of the things along those lines, just treat them as having had to have said that you must control it to activate and resolve the effect. I know it sounds weird, but once you understand which cards require you to have that, hopefully it'll better help you understand which cards you can actually use MST against. Another good example is that Fire Formation Tenki is a continuous spell that has a very similar effect to Reinforcement of the Army. However, because it's a continuous spell and because Reinforcement of the Army is a normal spell, if you use MST on the Tenki, it will prevent the effect from resolving correctly, but if you use the effect on Reinforcement of the Army, it won't actually prevent it. But see how the cards are very similar there? They do about the same thing. They add a level 4 monster to your hand of varying types. However, in the case of Tenki, because it's a continuous spell card, MST actually will stop its effect. The monster equivalent of this, or the best example for the monster equivalent, is a card like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and this sort of comes up in a few other rulings as well, but the one that I want to focus on right now is using Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit like an MST against monster effects. Let's say your opponent normal summons Elemental Hero Stratos and uses its effect. Because your opponent has met the criteria for Ghost Ogre, some newer players might think that discarding Ghost Ogre and destroying the Elemental Hero Stratos will actually prevent the search from happening. However, because the exact same rulings that we just talked about with Mystical Space Typhoon also apply in this situation, your opponent's Stratos will be destroyed, however, they will still get the search. But there are some cards, some monster cards, that have the same text that the implied text of the continuous cards is. Let's take a look, for example, at Naturia Beast. This card says during either player's turn when a spell card is activated, you can send the top 2 cards of your deck to the graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. Now in the newer printings of this card though, they added an extra line that says this card must be face up on the field to activate and to resolve this effect. Now there aren't a lot of monster cards that have this extra piece of text on them, and unlike the case of continuous spells and traps and things along those lines, don't assume that monster cards have this line of text on there. All monster cards that will be using this ruling will directly say that sentence. So in the case of Naturia Beast, if your opponent has a Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, you actually won't be able to properly resolve the effect, unlike in the case of many other monster effects. So in the case of continuous spells and continuous traps and equip spells and things along those lines, you don't actually have to see that line of text on there, and actually most cards, if not all of those types of cards, won't have that sentence on the card. However, in the case of monster cards, you need to look for that specific line of text that all monster cards like Naturia Beast will have on them to determine whether or not a card like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit will actually prevent the effect from resolving. Now that we have the basics down, I want to end this video talking about one step further in relation to rulings related to Mystical Space Typhoon. So in the case of a card like Autonomous Action Unit, which is an equip spell, it says pay 1500 life points and target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, semicolon, special summon that target to your side of the field and face up attack position and equip it with this card. When this card leaves the field, destroy the equipped monster. So there's a lot to unpack with this card, but what I want you to mainly focus on is that the cost of this card is paying 1500 life points and targeting a monster in your opponent's graveyard. We know that that's a cost and that is the activation requirement because it's all before the semicolon. I've talked about that in a few other videos, but that's the basics of what problem solving card text does. It's anything before the semicolon is the cost or activation requirement. So if you chain a Mystical Space Typhoon to Autonomous Action Unit, what happens? Well, what happens is that your opponent still targets the card, they still pay the 1500 life points, but after that the card resolves without effect. Now the important thing to note here is that you pay the cost before your opponent has a chance to respond. So in the case of Autonomous Action Unit, if your opponent was to play that card against you, I suppose you could flip up the Mystical Space Typhoon immediately if you wanted to, but how it's supposed to work is that your opponent would pay the 1500 life points, they'd write that down or put it in their calculator, and then they would tell you which card they're targeting, and at that point, that's when it's your turn to respond to that activation with Mystical Space Typhoon or any other card effect you might have. Luckily, this is spelled out specifically in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Rulebook, which you can find online for free, and it's in the glossary under the section that says pay a cost, and I'll read that for you guys right here. It says, to pay a cost is an action required by a player in order to activate a card, an effect, or to summon a monster. Tributing to tribute summon a level 5 monster is an example of a cost. Other common costs are discarding, paying life points, or banishing cards. You have to pay any cost before you declare the activation of a card. Even if the activation of the card is negated, you cannot get a refund of the cost that you have paid. This obviously applies to Autonomous Action Unit when you use Mystical Space Typhoon, but where you might not think it applies or where a couple players might get confused about it, which is perfectly fine, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of rulings, is that if you activate Autonomous Action Unit and your opponent has a Solemn Judgment, just like in the case of Mystical Space Typhoon, you still have to pay those life points, you still have to target a card before your opponent flips up that Solemn Judgment. In all cards of Yu-Gi-Oh! And all situations of Yu-Gi-Oh! You always have to pay the cost and fully resolve doing that cost before your opponent gets a chance to respond, even if they have a card like Solemn Judgment that would negate the card entirely. I don't usually talk about the playlists that I have on my channel in my videos because I figure that people that want to find those will just find those on my channel homepage. However, in the case of today's video, I do want to directly call action to go check out the Yu-Gi-Oh! Analysis for Beginners playlist if you're interested in learning more about Yu-Gi-Oh! Rulings at a tournament and competitive level. I'm specifically going to link a video from that playlist in today's video's description because that video directly relates to what we just talked about, and that's that video talks about how to read cards and understand costs and activation requirements and effects. All of these things are very important to understand even for playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Casually, just for the situations that I described with MST versus Autonomous Action Unit. If you don't know how to read problem-solving card checks, if you don't know how to read Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, it might not be super obvious which part of Autonomous Action Unit is a cost and which part is the effect, therefore which part does MST stop from resolving. That could be pretty confusing if you don't know how to read cards, so I definitely heavily advise checking out the video if you'd like more information on this topic. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on Mystical Space Typhoon and whether or not it negates some cards or all cards or a few cards. I hope you learned something along the way, and absolutely check out the Yu-Gi-Oh! Analysis for Beginners playlist if you're interested in learning more about Yu-Gi-Oh! Rulings and analysis. I'll see you later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.